Good evening. My name's Frank Algramashia and I'm a researcher at RMIT studying the election promises of Australian governments as part of a collaborative project between RMIT, Monash University and the Australian National University. I'm so glad to welcome you all tonight to RMIT's beautiful Capitol Theatre. On behalf of RMIT, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Bunwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands I work. I respectfully acknowledge ancestors and elders, past and present. We're so thrilled to be partnering with the Wheeler Centre tonight to bring you this incredible panel. And happy to be welcoming Barrie Cassidy and Patricia Karvelas back to RMIT, both of whom have worked with us as adjunct professors and are joining us tonight alongside Paul Sakow and George Megalogenis. Before we get to the panel, I want to take a moment to let you all know about the RMIT Election Promise Tracker, which will be available soon on RMIT's website and is designed to keep voters informed about how well the federal government is keeping its promises over this parliamentary term. It tracks 66 key commitments made before the last election and details the developments for each of these pledges, with a final assessment of the government's record to be made after the election is called. The team of researchers and journalists who maintain the tracker are part of the new RMIT Information Integrity Hub in the School of Media and Communication, which is dedicated to developing critical awareness of mis- and disinformation. Thank you. I hope you all enjoy tonight's proceedings, and I'd like to welcome Erin Vincent, CEO of the Wheeler Centre, to the stage.
Good evening. My name is Erin Vincent. I'm the CEO of the Wheeler Centre, and I'd also like to acknowledge we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to celebrate the culture and tradition of storytelling on these lands. Welcome everyone to our very first event for 2025. And whether we like it or not, this is an election year. So what better way to kick off our year-round programming than with four of the country's leading political analysts on the day of a very long-awaited interest rate cut. When we thought about an event to help the public make sense of politics right now, what a task, we wanted the very best. And what a delight it is to have Barrie Cassidy and this incredible panel with us here tonight. I know, in fact, I hear firsthand just how much the country misses Barrie's piercing insights. Before taking this role, I had a career in journalism at the ABC, and in that time, I had the very great pleasure of working as executive producer on Insiders with Barrie. On the occasions we catch up, I can tell you he can't go anywhere without people telling him just how much they miss his analysis and his excellent sense of humour. Barrie is one of Australia's most experienced political journalists, having created and hosted Insiders for 18 years. He is now chair of the board of Old Parliament House in Canberra, also known as the Museum of Australian Democracy. Tonight, Barrie is joined by George Megalogenis, an author and journalist with more than 3 decades' experience in the media. Through his award-winning books and columns over the years, George has dissected politics, history, and social and economic trends in Australia unlike anyone else. His most recent quarterly essay was Minority Report, The New Shape of Australian Politics, a topic that is so relevant to this election and, no doubt, tonight's discussion. Patricia Karvelas is a prominent Australian journalist with a career spanning 20 years at the ABC, The Australian and SBS. She is no doubt enjoying a kinder, gentler alarm clock after finishing up as host of Radio National flagship program RN Breakfast last year. Patricia now hosts the ABC's daily political program Afternoon Briefing, and is co-host of the popular weekly podcast The Party Room and the ABC's new politics podcast Politics Now. She also seamlessly presents one of television's most testing formats, Q&A, where I also had the pleasure of working with her as executive producer. And Paul Sakow is the federal political correspondent for The Age and Sydney Morning Herald. Paul previously covered Victorian politics, winning 2 Walkley Awards, including Young Journalist of the Year in 2021 for his groundbreaking reporting on the shortcomings in Victoria's hotel quarantine system, which ultimately led to a deadly second wave of the virus. I know you're very keen to hear from this panel, so I promise not to take up too much more of your time. You may or may not know that the Wheeler Centre is a non-profit organisation that relies on the generosity of its supporters and partners, including RMIT, our partner for this evening's wonderful event. This year is a particularly exciting one for the Wheeler Centre. We're marking our 15th birthday and we've launched an ambitious 3-year plan to make our programming more impactful, to reach more people and to realise our vision of being a centre for everyone. To support our big plans, we're launching a major fundraising campaign. So if you or anyone you know can make a contribution, big or small, I am delighted to say our founding patrons, Tony and Maureen Wheeler, have generously announced they will match every donation up to $1 million. It is an incredible and generous pledge, and it has the power to transform the centre's future. I'm so proud to lead an organisation that celebrates books, writing and ideas in a city that loves to read, loves to be informed and prides itself on being a UNESCO City of Literature. Here at the Wheeler Centre, we don't shy away from tough conversations. In fact, we believe there's never been a more important time to lean into them, and we do it with care and respect. At a time when social media platforms reinforce the worldviews they think we want to hear, it has never been more important to seek out perspectives that are different to our own, more so than ever when an election looms. I know you will enjoy tonight's discussion. Please give a very warm welcome to Barrie Cassidy, George Megalogenis, Patricia Carvelis and Paul Sakal.
Well, thanks for coming along, everybody. It's great to be working with the Wheeler Centre and especially in this amazing theatre. We will focus, of course, on the election, which I think we'll explain why a little later on, but I think it'll be a milestone election, whoever wins, because of the prospect of a minority government. But before then, as Erin mentioned, happy Interest Rates Day. I'm sure a lot of you are feeling very flushed for cash after a 25 basis point interest rate cut. Okay, it comes after 12 increases, but the cycle has been broken, I guess, and that's the key point here. So before we get to the election proper, Paul, as a result of what we heard today, do you think Anthony Albanese will rush off to an election? It would seem a bit cynical to do so, but there was a suggestion he could call it as early as Friday. What do you think will happen?
There's actually not that many options left. So for all the speculation, there are not that many dates he can go on. So March 29 has been talked about. That rumour's really reached fever pitch in the last week, I think largely led by rumours that have emanated from Peter Dutton's office. They tend to spread these rumours around Canberra during sitting weeks just to create a sense of chaos.
And journalists sort of lose their minds, don't they?
Yeah, not good ones like us, though, Patricia. So March 29 is one option, April 5 is another option, April 12 is another one, and then there's 2 weekends in May, May being the latest he can go. I don't think he will go on March 29, or March 29 I think is the least likely because there's a lot of crossover with the WA election. It would mean that he's campaigning for a federal election for a bit over a week inside the WA state election, and WA is a crucial state and he wants to do nothing to piss off voters there. So I still think April 5 and 12 are the most likely. That would avoid them needing to do a budget on March 25, which would be a deficit and not good news for the government. But May is not out of the question either. What do you think, PK?
I think what you think. No, and actually we are very much aligned on this. I think it's unlikely he'll call it this weekend, but I don't know. Can I just say anyone who pretends they know is like lying?
Did Did the PM do a walkthrough of your bureau on the Thursday after the last sitting week?
He did.
Was he making the same jokes about potentially having an election as late as September?
It's a joke he thinks is really funny.
He thinks it's very funny.
He thinks it's the funniest election,
because
but it's not that funny.
Constitutionally, he can do a half Senate
Yes,
election and a House election in September. He's never going to do it, but he likes to joke about it.
Thinks it's hilarious.
And George, I think probably the clue is to look for the window, right? He wants to avoid a long clash with the WA election, but he also wants to avoid a budget.
Yep.
So that suggests one of the 2 April dates.
Yeah, so the question on the budget, because the budget will slip back in a deficit, and the confirmation of that is unavoidable, because whenever the election is called, there'll be the update of the budget under the Charter of Budget Honesty. So you'll know the numbers one way or the other. But if there's a deficit and you don't release a budget, you don't have to go into line by line detail about how you're going to try and rein that in. So the government doesn't go to an election taking money off people. But if it were me, I'm not saying if it were me, but another argument would have been if they had a big tax reform plan to plonk it in the budget and then force the House to vote on it. But they obviously are not at that stage. So that's the other reason why you wouldn't go to a budget. You wouldn't go to a budget if it's just housekeeping, maintenance.
And on the interest rate cut, I'm sure, George, you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I can remember in the last 20 years or so 2 interest rate rises on the eve of a budget. There was one with Kevin Rudd and there was one the last time, right?
Yep.
And as interest rate rises went up, the opposition won both of those elections. But I can't recall a cut just before or during an election campaign.
So not this close. So the closest cut at the top of the cycle, the first cut down, that's 1990.
That's why we love him.
So that was, for those of you who were probably borrowers then, there may be more deposit holders now than borrowers in the room, so a couple of people might not be happy about lower interest rates. But in 1990, obviously this is the one everyone remembers, where the mortgage rate got to 17%. The last interest rate increase was in the middle of 89, and at that point the economy had already cracked, and so everybody had overshot in those days, and there was a small cut in interest rates at the beginning of 1990 in January, and Bob Hawke raced to an election, called one just before it was clear that we were going into recession. So that's the closest parallel I can think of. But one small difference, through the late 80s into that 1990 election, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer were telling you why interest rates were high and that we were on a long journey to restructure the economy. And the electorate rewarded the honesty, notwithstanding the pain. This time around, the Reserve Bank's responsible for interest rates. It's not my thing. I don't want to comment on it, which is a position both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer are taking. You get less of a sense that you're on this epic journey to make Australia more viable entity than you did in 1990. So that's where the parallel really breaks down. It breaks down in the shop front in terms of the salesman.
And the Reserve Bank Governor today, I was a bit surprised by that, but she tried to make it clear that she's not saying the next movement will be down either. You can't assume anything about where it goes from here, which sort of, you can't technically really say interest rates are falling. They've fallen.
They've fallen, but
are they necessary?
Look, and I'm not in their heads, but if you were looking at the world as it is now, after Trump 2.0, with all those executive orders and threats of trade wars all over the place and sort of geopolitical instability, you're the Reserve Bank of Australia, you want to leave something in the bank in case things get really bad by the middle of the year. And I think that's the other reason why you get the one interest rate cut, because if they'd held them, it would have shot confidence. And we're close enough to a sort of technical recession anyway, even though unemployment's low. So I suspect, and I think she means it when she says that doesn't mean there'll be one next month.
Yep.
But she's certainly thinking about having enough in the bank to be able to cut them quickly.
Yeah. Well, what do you make?
Countering what we just said, the next RBA meeting is in the first days of April, which would put it 4 days before an April 5 election and a couple of weeks before an April 12 one. If she does hold, as she's flagged, the board will do, that will not be a great news story for Labor. So that brings March 29 more into the equation, despite the other complication.
Right.
Oh, God.
All right, but let's now talk about why I think this election will be really significant, and we'll look back on it as so, because I think it's the final manifestation of the gradual decline in the support for the two major parties, and this is the one that really brings it home deep into minority government territory. We did have minority government in 2010, 15 years ago, but that was a sort of a shallow dip into minority government. This will be much deeper, I would imagine, and perhaps more permanent. When I first went to Canberra in 1980, the primary vote for the major parties was 92%. George reminded me before that by 1990 it was still very close to that, and now it's around 68% or so. That's a big decline. So I think first of all, before we look at the implications of that, why did it happen? What did the major parties do? What was it about the way that we've been governed over that period that caused this to happen, George? I'm not going to give you a 20-minute answer. I'll give you a couple of minutes and get some of the panellists who have got a little more match fit than me in the last few years, because I'm not in the day-to-day game anymore. But none of the above vote, as I call it, which is neither Labor nor coalition vote, that's increased at every federal election since the 2007 election. So the 2007 election is the last normal change of government where there's a primary vote swing against the incumbent and it goes straight into the opposition. It went straight to Labor's pile. 2007, as you've noted, to 2007 we go minority, but in each election after that, there's an increase in the third-party vote, and then regardless of what happens to individual major parties. So what are the big things that have changed over the last 15 or so years, which has accelerated a trend that was really coming from the 90s? And one of the big ones is 2010 leadership change. 2013, on the eve of the election, leadership change. Abbott goes. Turnbull doesn't call an early enough election to disprove the thesis. 2016, they're back to a one-seat majority. 2019, of course, there's been another leadership change in between. The parties themselves sense that the electorate was harder to communicate with, and the parties are also hollowing out because their membership base is pretty narrow. Digital media is making it very difficult to tell the same story to the electorate at large, to have the same conversation. The parties, I think, in the decade we've just watched, panicked. And that revolving door of leadership, I think, accelerates a trend. And then the thing that tips it over the edge, because the thing with the Teals at the last election was really an own goal from Scott Morrison, because he sort of faffed around and was trying to get pre-selection sorted out in New South Wales, didn't see this freight train coming. Half the Teals hadn't even committed to running at the end of 2021. Put a call to election in December, and we'd only know maybe 2 names. Now, of course, there were 7 there, adding to Zali Steggall from 2019. So Morrison, in a way, is a bit of an accelerant. But this trend's been building, as you've acknowledged, all the way through the 21st century. And I'd add, my 3 headlines would be media, leadership instability, media environment, leadership instability, and the hollowing out of the parties. I think between those 3 things, you've probably got a thesis. You've got something to add to that list? I have.
Well, I do. I mean, I think the digital revolution is at the heart of it personally, and I think it's accelerated the trend that we've seen, and I think it's why we're seeing the extra acceleration. I mean, I often hear people say, God, look at this backlash to the government. And I think everything is turbocharged in the kind of media environment we're in. So it doesn't surprise me so much. I actually am surprised they've held on for this long. The surprise to me is that they're getting any of the vote they're still getting. I just think the world's changed so fast. But the other one is, of course, when I grew up in my suburb, everyone voted Labor. It was a very working class suburb out in the west of Melbourne. That's just everyone was. I hadn't met someone who voted Liberal till it was just the way it is. People are not rusted. Sorry?
Till you joined the Australian.
Till I met George. Joking. Yes, till I'm...
Sorry.
Yeah, that's when. No, university. Anyway, but I think that the job market has changed a lot too, and the kind of deregulation of the job market, the gig economy, all of the different ways that our jobs have changed is at the heart of it as well. And so I think look at the backlash of the working class in the United States. I think we're seeing something similar here. I don't think people who are working class, so to speak, align themselves with Labor as a brand the same way. And I think that started on the back of Howard's battlers, so to speak, like where he really was talking to that part of the electorate. And I think it's been a slow clawing since. And so those traditional brands have really eroded.
Paul?
Just two things. I'm expanding on the media point. I don't think you can underestimate how difficult it is to reach different parts of the electorate now. In the 90s, Howard and Keating are speaking to the mainstream press and their message is getting out at 6 p.m. Now a 21-year-old Greens voter is just not looking at the same information ever in their day as a 35-year-old new mum in Narre Warren. They're looking at different platforms, they're absorbing different messages. So for political parties, it's very hard to reach different audiences. The Prime Minister's trying to speak to a really diverse electorate, looking at the news that they read and struggling to target them. So it means micro parties can fill that gap and cater to different sections, which is why you've got One Nation, the Teals, Greens, it's more fragmented. But also just the loss of, the second point I'll make is the general decline in trust and health of institutions in the community. I mean, the church is, if it's not dead, it's dying. How many people go to church on Sunday? Union density is at an all-time low. AFL clubs buck this trend, particularly in this city. It's incredible the amount of membership they have, and it's a fantastic thing. I'm a struggling Essendon supporter, but political parties are suffering the same fate. They don't have the role in the society they used to have.
Yeah. Part of the problem, I take your point about the political parties not figuring out how to reach people, but the political parties do they largely control the processes, and that's the problem. Yep. The process has become so conflicted, there's so much animosity, there's no consensus. I think it's the rigidity of party politics in the major parties that are starting to turn people off. I mean, when that Senator Payman thing happened, whatever you might think of the circumstances around that, it was when the Labor Party made it clear to her loyalty is to the party first. Mm. When the new British Prime Minister came in, on the night of the election, he said, my loyalty is to the people. And I don't think there's the same sense of that here. Their policies are so rigid. But George, as you make it clear in the Minority Report, the quarterly essay that will be available for sale later on, you talk about the other factor in all of this, and it's a big factor, is that the alternative, the crossbench now, is a very different beast than it was in Julia Gillard's time. Now, explain that.
Yeah, so I can remember the numbers off the top of my head. So Coalition got 73 seats, Labor got 72, and there were 5 on the crossbench. And Gillard got 4 of the 5 of the crossbench to form minority government. Got it to 76 out of 150 seats. That crossbench, remember, was Bob Catter, Rob Oakeshott, Tony Windsor, Andrew Wilkie and Adam Bant. 2 capital cities, so Hobart, Melbourne, 3 regionals. So 1 regional Queensland, 2 regional New South Wales.
All blokes?
All blokes. 5 members of different generations of the patriarchy, with the first female Prime Minister. Now think about it. And remember, we had to wait 17 days, and then there was that excruciating joint press conference with the independents when they were about to anoint the next government of Australia. And Robert Oakeshott gave one of those speeches where you didn't know whether he was at a wedding or at a funeral or whether he was resigning himself. And then he eventually got around to saying, oh, and by the way, it's Labor. That was a very, very narrow cast crossbench. And it was a crossbench that was more aligned with the experience that we'd had in federal politics from the 90s when the first of the independents were being elected. You're more likely to get them from the regions and the cities. The last federal election, and this again is on Scott Morrison, but not just Scott Morrison, by the way, Labor lost 3 capital city seats as well. There's a seat that they should have won in Brisbane, which they lost to the Libs, lost to the Greens. They lost their own Griffiths and they lost Fowler as well. But the crossbench at the last election wasn't 5, it was 16. 13 of the 16 were from the capital cities, not the regions. And the new entrants, pretty much all the new entrants are women. Not just women, by the way, but women with a career before, like substantial careers before politics. The sort of person you would have wanted to wish on the system the last 20 years when it was just retreading the same old white guy, factional warrior, meet your new Prime Minister. I know you haven't heard of him, but this bloke is your new Prime Minister. That is a substantial step change in the makeup of the Parliament. Now, if they're able to hold, we will go into speculation later about what it might look like, but if that's a permanent shift and it's in the cities and it's in the electorates that used to produce Prime Ministers for the Liberal Party in the main, and it's a group of MPs who have been sent to Canberra to fix the system, not to disrupt it in the same way the Trump voters or Brexit voters might have in the US or UK. This is a substantial change in our Parliament.
Patricia?
I think that's absolutely right. And something happened over the weekend that I keep labouring the point about, and so indulge me. For the first time, I heard the Liberal leader in 2 significant interviews, that being Peter Dutton, entertain and talk actively about him forming a minority government. And I'm actually a little surprised that some of my colleagues didn't make a bigger deal of it, because don't you reckon it was quite a moment? And the reason it's a moment is that all Liberal leaders, as we've had these conversations as far back as Julia Gillard being able to form that, have always been steadfast. You know, we won't talk about it, we won't entertain it. There's certainly, before an election, would never have been talk about which independents he might deal with. And a lot of discussion I've had with colleagues and people in politics as well who are active participants, MPs and staffers, and they say, you know, basically it's like Peter Dutton has looked at the same polling that everyone else has. He doesn't actually believe in his heart of hearts that he can form majority government. He thinks it's possible, but it's obviously everything has to go right. Everything. Like so much. Like it really is almost the fantasy day for the Liberal Party that I can't quite imagine. And so in that case, he's now entered a period of trying to put pressure on independents, particularly independents, Di Lee, there are others, Allegra Spender, of course, to try and position himself as the more likely Prime Minister after the election. And I don't know what you think, Paul, but I have not seen that. And I think that it is a significant shift going to the essay that Meg has written, which basically is the first open concession from a leader that this is the new normal.
Yeah, he knows if he gets there, it's going to be super tight and he'll probably fall just short. It's also much, just on the point about the diversity of the current crossbench, it's a much more difficult crossbench for Peter Dutton to navigate if he gets close to a majority than it is for the Prime Minister. That's because pretty much all but one teal, being Allegra Spender, is progressive and would be quite hostile to working with Peter Dutton.
There's Di Lee if she gets
returned.
returned.
Di Lee, Rebecca Sharkey, Bob Katter. And I think so Albanese's got the Greens plus pretty much all the Teals plus Andrew Wilkie, plus Helen Haynes, who are more likely to back him.
Only if he wins more seats than the coalition.
So this is the point.
Which is the current projection.
I thought the most significant thing that he did by countenancing the option of minority was to define what victory for him was, which is one more seat than Labor.
That's it.
Yes, it was a big deal, wasn't it?
Just the mandate.
Albanese spent the last 18 months watching Dutton play him off a break, and then he played him off a break again over the weekend, which was, rather than Albanese setting the terms for what this election's about, what this government wants to do with its second term, and, you know, we're open, because obviously the votes are tight, we're open to talking with everyone. Dutton said straight out, in very brutal terms, you know, if I've got 67 and he's got 66, I don't care how many seats it takes for me to get to 76, I'm first in line, I've won. Yep. And he'd be doing that thing, by the way, just a quick flashback to 2010, which I thought was interesting in terms of the psychology on the night. Even though it was clear Labor had lost its majority, Julia Gillard stood up, very, very brave 10 minutes in her career, where she said, we're going to win the popular vote after distribution of preferences, and we can form a minority government. Tony Abbott didn't do any of that. Tony Abbott said, we've just torn them down, whatever. But she went very, very mechanically to the point of what the next 2 weeks was going to look like, and she set the terms for what success would look like for her, and it made sense when they fell in line for her. And Dutton's played Albanese off a break on this point, because he's made it clear that even a score draw is a win for him. He's completely redefined the terms of the contest.
Well, this time, Wilkie has said this, Helen Haynes followed up after he did, that this time they will not be offering supply. They'll not be offering support. It will be on a policy-to-policy basis. Now, how does that work? At some point, if one party beats the other by two or three seats, they have to make a choice. Otherwise,
somebody's going to have to
whoever wins the most seats can go to the Governor-General and say, I've got the most seats, trust me. But it's not going to be like last time, where they'll all sit around and figure it out.
Well, they won't be signing deals with the Greens or with the Teals. Like, it won't be formal.
And in fact, you wouldn't recommend it based on the last experience, because almost the first mistake of that minority government that Gillard led was the joint press conference with and by the way, they've got a policy which I ruled out during the campaign, and we're going to go for it.
The next big question around this, of course, if it happens is, will it be good or bad for governance, good or bad for the country, good or bad for democracy? I do think that the media, they don't say it collectively, but a lot of them tend to talk about the chaos of minority government. I think the fact that it's unpredictable doesn't make it chaotic. And it doesn't make it certainly any less interesting. But is it fair to immediately assume that a break away from the two-party system and a period of minority government is necessarily a bad thing?
Absolutely outrageous to even suggest it, I think, because an election is a reflection of how people want their parliament to look like. Like, it's actually the democratic execution of your vote. So it is incumbent on whoever is elected to be able to form a stable government, because that's what the people sent them to do. So I've heard, like, internally in politics, people say, oh, you know, if it was really unstable, maybe you'd have to go to another election. It's like, no, you have to work with the parliament that's delivered to you. And the idea that it's chaotic, well, only in so much as democracy can be messy. Like, if every policy, or so to speak, or every bill has to be negotiated on, I mean, it happens in the Senate. It just means you have to do it in the lower house too. You have to be more organised, but like, that's why we send them to Canberra. And I think that if people are moving away from the major parties, which they clearly are on all the metrics, that you can't kind of think that they're idiots. It seems that they have they know what they're doing, and they knew exactly what they were doing at the last election, and that you need to sort of respect that. Now, if people decide that they do find it a little unruly, then they'll correct, I suppose, but that is the parliament that you elect, and you have to work with it. And so I think it's actually healthy, although I agree he's kind of, with George, that he's set the terms for Albanese, but I also think it's kind of healthy for Dutton to talk about the parliament that might be delivered.
Well, it might be volatile, Paul, but it's a system that invites consensus, it invites cooperation.
And I think for that reason, a minority government would suit one of, he's got some strengths, some of them are diminished in office, but something that I think the PM does have that's a big advantage on Dutton is that he is a consensus builder. He is a good deal maker. He works with the parliament quite collaboratively, and he's a person who knows how to deal with numbers. He was the he was the leader of the House in the Gillard government when it was a minority. You often hear people say that term delivered more legislation than any other term. I'm not sure if that's a great measure. It was a pretty chaotic parliament, and the 90-seat win by Abbott in 2013 probably indicated that minority government is not good for a government. But yeah, it does invite consensus building. I do think, though, if you look at European examples of countries where majorities are almost never formed in the parliament, it is often a recipe for deadlock and poor policy making. So that's a totally personal call. I'd be very cautious about saying it would be a good thing for Australian democracy.
When you look at it, though, in how it would work, if Labor was the minority government, the Teals would certainly push Labor in a direction that it's been reluctant to go to, because they lack the ticket to go there. I'm talking about things like tax reform, but also the gambling, restrictions on sports gambling, advertising, all sorts of governance issues. The fact that we've got a climate change policy that still allows for gas beyond 2050 and so on. There are so many issues where I think the Teals would straighten the back of Labor and give them something.
Absolutely.
Whereas I don't see how it operates as effectively if Dutton was to win, because they've become too adversarial as groups.
So think about a couple of scenarios, and this really does depend on the seat count. So if Labor is the minority government and they've got a 7 in front of their seat count, so they start with 71, 72, 73, that means the coalition are a long way behind, and that means the Dutton strategy has failed. And the gap between Labor and the coalition pretty much answers the question of whether the coalition can disrupt a minority government. It can't. It's too far behind to disrupt it. And so, you know, at that point, Albanese can mix and match because he's got a number of options to get things through the lower house. He'll still have the complications of the Senate, but that government will probably function pretty reasonably. If you had it in the other direction, Labor is only 1 or 2 seats ahead of the coalition, that government is not going to last 3 It's not going to last a full 3-year term, and the Prime Minister certainly won't make it to the 18-month mark if it's too tight. Because at that point, the incentives at the margin for the show-stopping backbench you'd never heard of to suddenly cross the floor or to go out on their own. Already 5 people in the Senate since the last election have changed the party that they were elected for, 5. There are a number of reasons for each, but collectively you'd think that dynamic would operate in a really, really tight, where both parties are in the 60s. Yeah. Now, if Dutton is ahead by 1 or 2, does he actually want a 3-year term, or does he want to pull against a demoralised Labor opponent, pull an obstruction stunt and then go to an early election? I know that's what Abbott wanted to do, and that's why Oakeshott and Windsor didn't entertain the option of an Abbott minority government, because he thought Abbott was going to go to an early election. So I think that's one thing we don't know about Dutton at the moment. Is he still thinking trying to get 2010 right the second time around?
I don't think he wants to govern from a high 60s position, Dutton, or even try.
Yeah.
If there's a great strength of Dutton, people can argue whether this is a good thing for our politics, but he's made this term of Parliament, where Labor's had a steady majority, feel chaotic at times. He's excellent at going into Parliament and creating a sense of disunity on the other side, of lack of direction. So getting Labor to a position where they're in the low 70s potentially and quite precarious would be ideal for Dutton. His office is stacked full of former Tony Abbott staffers, so they're well prepared.
Well, let's go back now to looking at the position that we're now in. In Australia, we give pretty much all elected governments a second term. You have to go back 94 years to 1931 when a first-term government was thrown out, and that was during a depression. So it takes a lot. So why is this election seemingly so tight? And also consider that 1 year into this term, they won a by-election off the opposition.
Which hadn't happened in 100 years.
Which again is a once-in-a-century event.
Okay.
What happened?
Okay. So...
You've got all the answers.
I do. I've been, pouring over this too. I don't think we can underestimate the timing of the voice referendum and that long period of time, and that it took so long to get the wording. By the time we got to that referendum, just think about it, that took out the whole year. And this was, of course, as people's cost of living was increasing and people felt the crunch. The timing of having a referendum on something which clearly was, not agreed upon in the community at a time when people were really struggling was, history will show, terrible timing, right? And so I don't think the government has really ever recovered from that. And you'll notice at the moment that Peter Dutton barely stands up and speaks without mentioning and reminding to voters that the voice referendum distracted the government for a long period of time. Now, all incumbent governments, almost all, around the world have obviously suffered greatly because of the cost of living crisis. I know we're sick of hearing the term cost of living crisis, I am too, but I don't think we can underestimate just how extreme it's been for some households. It's easier if you can you can absorb it a bit. It's still tough up and down the income scale if you're obviously a higher income earner, but if you are not a high income earner, it is absolutely smashing people much more than anyone appreciates unless they live out of Western Sydney, out of Western Melbourne. It is an absolute smasher. And so when you juxtapose a government spending a year on something that people did not connect with, and that's a whole other panel about why, but at a time where they were struggling, I think it actually makes sense that the government is having some of these. I don't see it as at all surprising when you put all of that together. And at the same time, I think the Prime Minister has lacked a bit of cut-through. And I've said that in many places. I think that Peter Dutton has had more cut-through than the Prime Minister. Put that all together, it's been very hard.
It's an understatement on the cut-through, I think.
Well, I'm a polite woman.
Paul, what's your view on what happened? Obviously, it was the voice didn't help, but then the cost of living crisis happened, and when interest rates go up 12 times in 15 months, that's going to have an impact.
I feel a bit embarrassed for how caught up in the honeymoon period I got. There was a period at the start of this term where Labor's primary vote increased to 40, 41, 42% in opinion polling, which is really high for Labor. I think it was, I think a lot of the media forgot how weak Labor's mandate was when it got in. It got in on a 32.5% primary vote, which is all-time low, snuck in on 2-seat majority. First-term governments almost always go backwards at their second election. He's got no fat to cut. So in an inflation crisis, which is generational, the worst since, what, the 80s, George?
Well, the biggest shock to living standards since the mid-70s.
Mid-70s.
Yep.
An incumbent government...
didn't help Whitlam at the time.
Always going to struggle badly. The Voice was a disaster. And social democratic parties around, like the global context is important, centre-left parties around the world are struggling to kind of know what they're about. Their kind of growth agenda is unclear. It's not, their constituency is shifting. Working class voters are voting on cultural issues and moving to the right. The union workforce is dwindling, and the Greens are cannibalising Labor from the left, just in the same way as Dutton's been cannibalised by the Teals and also right-wing minor parties. It was always going to be a tough term for Labor, and they've also found themselves with a Prime Minister who lacks a kind of effervescence, probably lacks a bit of he's not a person who takes an economic debate on with vigour. It's not his issue. He likes infrastructure, he likes talking about health and education. He governs in the mould of a state premier more than a Prime Minister sometimes, and I don't think the times we're in with global uncertainty, war in Europe and the inflation crisis have suited this Prime Minister.
And the cost of living, George, again, it's one thing for the cost of living to be the number one issue. Yeah. It's another to make a judgment about who has the policies around that. I mean, Ross Gitton's advice some time ago was to the public, vote for the party that you think will be least worst at handling the problem. Yeah. Good advice.
But you need a pretty sophisticated electorate.
How does the government then shift it away from a debate about cost of living, they concede that, and move it to one towards who can deal with it?
Yeah, I think they've wanted to talk about cost of living all the time. They haven't wanted to talk about Gaza. They haven't wanted to talk about the fallout from the Voice. They haven't wanted to talk about Australia Day. They haven't wanted to talk about, sort of patriotic merch or any of that stuff. They do want to talk about cost of living all the time because they want to set up the contest as us trying to look after you the best we can, and him, former health minister, try to impose a $7 levy tax to visit the GP with all these unspecified cuts and a nuclear program that he hasn't costed for you yet. That's what they want to do. They want to set it up in the way that Howard set up the 2004 election, which is, at that point, it was a long-term government. Interest rates are going up, and remember Howard's framing of Latham was, they'll be lower under me than under him. You can't trust him, L-plate. And I think that's kind of what they want to do, but they don't know how to do it. Does that make sense?
And I think we had this conversation before, George, but what Labor wants to talk about cost of living, and they get dragged into all kinds of cultural debates by Dutton and by sections of the media. But what does Labor actually say about the cost of living when they do talk about it? Is there a single policy that's implanted in voters' minds? Have they taken any single hard decision on raising taxes or lowering spending to actually rein in inflation? I do question whether they've actually made the policy decision.
I think one of their complications, and this is, if you told me 2 years, if you gave me 2 years worth of prior warning that there'd be a cost of living crisis and Jim Chalmers would deliver 2 consecutive surplus budgets and they'd retool the stage 3 tax cuts, you'd say they pretty much nailed it. But I think the problem that they've had, especially with those surpluses, is that they haven't been able to explain the why we're doing it this way, and this is a buffer that we're going to give to you in a time of need. They haven't been able to explain that. And they're a little terrified. I found them just a little terrified of taking the risk that says to the Australian electorate, listen, this is complicated and we're going to try something that we hope is in your interest, and if the Reserve Bank punishes with an extra interest rate rise, we think that's probably a risk worth taking. And what would that have looked like? Tax reform is obviously a very complicated issue at the moment, and they can't really go to an electorate with winners and losers, because the losers, you'll just hear about the losers. But if you've got an inflation shock that originates with Putin trying to reclaim Ukraine, trying to re-establish the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, and you get a huge spike in energy costs in Europe, and suddenly and you've got a pre-existing problem in Australia, which is cost of housing, plus you've got an energy shock. So you've got the two of them going on at the same time. Wouldn't you, if a Labor government said, right, for the next 2 years, I'm going to ensure that there's no at the kitchen table increase in energy prices for anyone. And I've got a surplus, I can afford to do it. And just made that your, this is a new era we're in, we're going to maybe break something, but we're going to try a policy to try and make this thing not as bad for you. And most people do understand the interest rate transaction. You're actually adding to the cost of living to try and reduce the cost of living. Like, interest rates are a very, very blunt weapon, and most people intuit that it doesn't make sense for that to be the only response. And I think they've been a bit passive.
Just a reminder that we will spend a few minutes as we get closer to 8 o'clock on questions, and that's how you do it. I'm glad I'm not sitting there and having to figure it all out, but that's how you do it. And I'll get the questions right here.
So it says slido.com/Barrie Cassidy. What does that mean?
That's the hashtag.
Yeah, George, he's got a hashtag.
You mentioned housing. Now, how significant? Well, look, it seems to me with housing now that it's a different debate than it was even 15 or 20 years ago, when John Howard said straight out, "I'm not going to devalue people's houses." I mean, that's their biggest.
The quote was, "No one ever shook their fist at me and said I'm complaining that my house is more expensive." Yeah.
The attitude towards that has changed a bit now. I think people of my generation and a bit younger realise that we got it good. The wages went up fairly regularly. Houses were cost in terms of the proportion of your income a whole lot less than they do now, and we're starting to appreciate how hard it is for our kids. Yeah. So attitudes seem to be changing. Are the major parties twigging of that? Are they doing enough on housing?
Look, Labor will tell you, and it frustrates them, and I'm sure Paul, because we both work in the everyday of it, they're so frustrated that they're spending, $32 billion, isn't it? $32 billion on a range of housing programs, and that they're not getting credit for it. They hate that. Drives them crazy.
What is any one of the parts of that?
Correctamundo. So the problem, of course, is that there's a kind of whole bunch of policies, and some of them are decent policies. I mean, you can sort of interrogate whether you like build to rent, or, there's obviously a lot more money for social housing. They have invested, but there has been a lag because of the broader problems we've had in the economy of actually getting these houses built. Some of it, Barrie, is a problem of the Federation, right? That obviously a lot of it is state regulation. They've been trying to create incentive for the state governments to change zoning laws, to have housing actually built near things that might actually get you to a job, rather than so far away that people have other costs and can't actually get to a job, which creates new problems. But I don't think they've had the cut through to try and mount an argument. And at the same time, we've had the Greens being really the effective opposition for a long time on housing, talking about really populist things that I think have limited merit in terms of changing the housing situation. And to the heart of your question, no one still has conceded the point that housing actually shouldn't be going up like it has historically. No one's done that. And you can understand why. There's still a large part of the population that would be, if it's your only asset, if you're told that your house price has to either go down or stagnate, that is not exactly a very appealing thing for a politician to tell you. But you do need a game changer when it comes to housing, and I don't think anyone's offered one. And given the election is going to be centred around housing being kind of linked to the cost of living issues, I don't feel like we've got the game changer that perhaps the government would need, and also for the opposition who wants to make it an issue. I mean, their super for housing might be popular, they tell me, with younger people, but it might be inflationary in terms of house prices, and it doesn't deal with stock and supply. So I just don't think anyone's really nailed it with housing, and yet it's the biggest problem that's raised in the community.
I think this policy issue goes as much as any policy issue to the question of the broader government, the criticism of them as being timid. There was a period when it was reported that Jim Chalmers was pushing for the government to look at negative gearing and capital gains tax. It was modelled in Treasury and then knocked on the head, and the government didn't proceed with it. There were some in the government who thought that would be the game changer that would create a reset and create real momentum for the government, because it would be a big thing to do. And Claire O'Neill, who's the Housing Minister now, a few weeks ago, didn't get picked up very much, but it went around social media rapidly. She did an interview with Triple J, which is the youth ABC broadcaster, and the question to her was, is this Labor government trying to bring down house prices to make them cheaper for people, or will your policies continue the price rise? And she says Labor will not do any policy that will bring house prices down. So Labor's in this catch-22 as well, and they have constituencies who are younger who want to see prices come down, but a lot who don't. And there's a huge cautiousness in the government to do anything that Bill Shorten did, and Bill Shorten tried to do capital gains and negative gearing, and so Albanese won't do it, partly for that reason.
Isn't this part of the problem with Albanese, is that because of that he became a small target in opposition, and he's never got out of the habit?
He's governing as a small target. Was that old Mario Cuomo, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose? Albo campaigns in dot points and governs in dot points. Yeah. He hasn't shifted at all. By the way, that negative gearing capital gains, it was being modelled. There was an accidental leak. It wasn't a malicious leak, and it came out too early, and it was before the government had worked out what it wanted to say. Remember, there was a day when Albanese said, we encourage the public service to do these things, and the next day he said, no, we're not going to do it. Yeah. He did get cut through the day he said he wasn't going to do it.
Right, we'll go to audience questions now, and I'm asking this one because this one has had the most likes. And it's a good question for all of you. Dutton seems to get a free pass from the media all the time. What can Labor do about that?
What can Labor do about the media? A free pass from the media all the time. Well, it's a good question. I don't know if he gets a free pass from all of the media. I think that...
Parts of it.
Parts of it, sure. I think that...
Obvious part.
That Peter Dutton... well, yes, I agree with that. But I don't think Peter Dutton has subjected himself to a whole range of rigorous interviews, and I think that is an issue, and that he should, because I think if you want to run for Prime Minister, you need to expose yourself to rigorous interviews. And really, that is at the heart of it. I don't think it's a case of the media necessarily all collectively dropping the ball, though. But ultimately, you can only cross-examine someone who makes themselves available to be cross-examined, right? So last week and the week before, I was in Canberra for the last 2 sitting weeks, he did take questions from the full press gallery, which was new and exciting. You all seemed beside yourself with joy.
You ran into one and demanded that your question be asked and said, hey, it's my turn.
I did. I said, this is my turn. That's because I was shocked, actually, Barry, to see a sea of men in front of Peter Dutton. I didn't realise the press gallery was still run by men. So, but it is. Did you notice that?
Now I recall. Yeah.
Absolutely appalling that my industry, that it was so feminised, had mainly only men asking questions. But either way, he had 2 press conferences where he took questions. I thought that was, kind of an improvement that he was taking questions from the press gallery. But I think he needs to be subjected to more questioning.
And you take the nuclear issue too. I mean, I assume that through the election campaign there'll be more opportunities to drill down on that one, because at this point there's a serious conflict between the experts and the scientists and the CSIRO and Peter Dutton.
Yeah, it's a good point. I just think to the first question, I do, firstly, to point out, it's kind of always been thus in recent times, that there are sections of the media that barrack for the coalition. I mean, you look at 2010, 2013 with Abbott, the way Shorten was treated throughout campaigns. I'm not necessarily having a crack at News Corp here, but media outlets have... I am talking about News Corp, but I'm not criticising them. I'm just pointing out that this is the way media organisations run, both here and around the world. Media proprietors having political bias is not a new thing. And I do think the left can overstate the weight. I give too much weight to the effect of barracking from sections of the media. And I think it's instructive to look at state government elections in recent times. I mean, in this state, the Herald Sun editorialised and truly went mad about Daniel Andrews for a long period of time, and he won 3 elections with increasing margins and dominated the state. So it's not insurmountable. And I think if the Prime Minister was a more forceful opponent to the opposition leader and was more of a brawler, there would be a greater ability to put scrutiny on him. He gets a free pass in part because I think Labor doesn't know how to deal with him.
George, here's a question on Trump, and it's a really interesting one because how has Trump's election impacted on our political environment? But I think it goes even further than that now too, that when you talk about disruptions in election campaigns and they come along every other day, but Trump's going to throw lots of those in there, and the two leaders now have been so far reticent to drill down and tackle some of what Trump is saying. As outrageous as some of his foreign policy positions are, we're not yet saying, well, this is a bit of a worry. We're not even saying that. During an election campaign, the Trump influence and the Trump disruptions are going to be fascinating.
They will be fascinating. So you've got whatever Trump, because Trump wants to own the world now as opposed to just owning the Democrats in his own jurisdiction. Every day he wants the entire world to be paying attention to him. So you can guarantee in the 33 days minimum of Australian federal election campaign, he will be the lead item during an Australian election campaign for things that have nothing to do with Australia. That's the first point. So that's unavoidable. What remains to be seen, but I think is also unavoidable, is that his nose suddenly, or Elon Musk's nose, suddenly intuits that there's an election in this place called Australia, and they'll want to actually comment directly on the election. And I think that is when it becomes completely unpredictable. I mean, he may announce a tariff, he may announce a policy that affects us economically, which I reckon would be more problematic for a Dutton than it would be for an Albanese at that point if he's punishing Australia, because then what, are you going to suck up to him or are you going to stand up to him? That, I don't know what happens at that point. That is a known unknown. But the other known unknown is when they decide to poke their nose in it, and they will, because that's what they've been doing in every other jurisdiction in Europe at the moment, in the UK.
Oh, they love poking their nose.
But I wonder in the Australian context, like with AFD in Germany and Reform in the UK, they're a big established...
No, they don't have a team to barrack for. At the moment, they'd be going to a footy game and barracking for somebody else's team that isn't on the pitch. But they'll still insist that they hold the whistle and they get to decide, and they are also going to be shooting for goals themselves. This is the bit it could be hilarious, but it can be quite a character test for our system. Now the third bit, and this is almost a great unknown, and this is definitely another panel, the Chinese are laughing their heads off at the moment, because the minute Trump put a freeze on all the US AID, all the foreign aid and investment work that they were doing, they went cold turkey. Places like the Solomon Islands, which did appear at the last federal election when they came up with that police agreement with the Chinese, and Scott Morrison wasn't allowed to ring the then President of the Solomon Islands, Sogavare. I remember there was advice to him, don't call him, he hates you. True story. The Chinese at the moment are swanning back into the Solomon Islands saying the Americans aren't a reliable partner, we can do all sorts of things for you. The kind of worst case scenario from a national security perspective is not so much the alliance, but the disruption in the Pacific from the Chinese on the march. And the Chinese are will be just as aware, in fact, I think it's already in their calendar that there's an Australian election coming. I think it'll only occur to Trump the day it's called. So that's to be honest, the thing that I really sweat about is that third part to the equation, which is we've lost an ally and we've got a neighbour who, is going to fill the vacuum.
Yeah. And there's one question specific to you, PK, on this one. Who do you think will better handle Trump, Albanese or Dutton?
I think that the competition between the two on how they'll handle Trump is a furphy, and that Trump is unpredictable, self-serving, that actually both of them could either fail or both of them could nail it based on Trump's mood and what they say. I don't buy the Peter, and I've written this on the ABC website, I don't buy the Peter Dutton view where he was trying to say, he'd work better with Trump, and he likes to remind, doesn't he, everyone of previous comments Anthony Albanese and Kevin Rudd have made about Donald Trump. But I don't think just because Donald Trump and Peter Dutton both don't like woke, that means they make better deals together. I don't know, that's not how Trump works. There's no evidence that Trump thinks we're ideologically aligned and now I'm going to help your country. He just doesn't do that. So I the fact that the Prime Minister had a successful phone call with him shows that really anyone can try and do a deal with Trump based on whether Trump thinks it's, in his interests. And also, either of them can spectacularly fail based on the last thing Trump was told about our aluminium, with many errors. So I think it's crap that one of them has the advantage there.
And there is a question here that we can deal with very quickly. Should we have 4-year fixed terms? I certainly think so, George.
Absolutely. Yep. Should have had them 15 years ago. It might have actually slowed the decline of the two-party system.
And given the experience in the UK and the experience where they got a very odd result, where Labor won massively with a 30% vote or something, and what we saw in the US where they don't have compulsory voting, I think we should thank our lucky stars that we do have compulsory voting. Okay, that's it. We're out of time. Thank you very much for coming along, and do your best to enjoy the election.
Thank you, everyone.